5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
SpaceX may allegedly IPO as early as next year, and a valuation of $1.5 trillion has been mentioned. That seems like it merits an episode. And I got a great guest for it. Aaron Burnett is the co-founder and CEO of Mach33, a space finance group. And they're actually doing a publicly available SpaceX financial model in conjunction with well-known investment firm Ark Invest. So Aaron is my guest this week, and we're talking all aspects of how to try to model SpaceX financially and what its valuation really might be. Enjoy. My name is Raphael Rodkin. I'm the founding partner of E2MC, Earth to Mars Capital, a venture capital investor in dozens of space startups worldwide, among other roles I have, such as being a part-time podcast host. Just as a reminder, this podcast is for informational purposes only. It does not reflect any view by E2MC, and nothing should be taken as investment advice. Before we start, a quick favor. If you do enjoy this podcast, please leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast app, such as Apple or Spotify. It does help other people find the podcast. Now on to today's episode. Hey, space enthusiasts. Time for another episode of the Space Business Podcast. Very excited because this is a slightly different episode. We are talking about a topic that might be considered relatively timely by quite a few of you out there, which is talking about SpaceX and its rumored IPO that may happen in 2026 or early 2027, I think is what the latest reports say. These are the timeframes, 2026, 2027. And I have a very qualified guest for that, who I've known for many years now in the space context. It's Aaron Burnett, and he's a co-founder and CEO of Mach33 Financial Group. Welcome, Aaron.
Thanks for having me, Raphael. It's great to be here, and crazy times with all the news around SpaceX.
Yeah, crazy good times, crazy exciting times. I personally think, and I even kind of dug out one of my many SpaceX t-shirts in honor of this episode, the Nuke Mars t-shirt. In any event, so before we kind of delve into SpaceX and the IPO, and basically to give our listeners a heads up what we're going to be talking about here, this is basically explaining what we believe is the current SpaceX business. It's obviously a private company, and so the information out there is limited, and people like myself and Aaron and others who are watching SpaceX and are not insiders, so to say, have to piece certain things together and make educated guesses. We're going to talk about what is the SpaceX business, what do we believe is it right now, and also what can it be in the future. And we kind of will a little bit go into financial modeling, sort of estimating revenues, maybe margins. Yeah, and then maybe in the end, if we get to this, also the valuation. But Aaron, we should kind of spend a couple of minutes about who you are, what you're doing, why am I talking to you about this?
Yeah, I appreciate that. So my co-founder and I, Brent Arsenault, started Mach33 and under a different brand about going on 6 years ago now. But really what we wanted was to kind of build a financial group of products and services that really help to accelerate space and human expansion fundamentally. Thinking about what would happen, if JP Morgan were around today. He invented syndicates to be able to diversify risk for railroads, because those were big projects and historic projects for financing back in the day. What would someone like that do, looking at expansion into space and all of the projects that are needing to be underwritten and financed there? And so what we've done over the last couple of years is really kind of have two businesses. One's on the research side, where we really put out a lot of research and help people understand. We found that there's a good amount of misunderstanding on the institutional investor side. To be fair, space in some cases is actual rocket science. And so you're mixing physics, engineering, and then also pretty intense financial modeling, and trying to marry that all together. It can be very difficult and very time consuming, and there's a diminishing return. So I think a lot of investors have just kind of hand wave space. So we try and do a lot of education there. And then on the asset management side, we are investing in companies where we're primarily in the private markets, looking for good opportunities, anything from early to late stage, trying to control a little bit where that capital is being placed so that we can affect the future that we want to see.
Terrific. Thank you for that. Okay, so let's talk SpaceX. And I think I always make this caveat in the canned intro to this podcast, but I will explicitly make it here again, given the nature of this podcast. Nothing that Aaron and I will be talking about should be considered financial advice. This is sort of two guys shooting the shit on SpaceX, and again, no one here has insider information that's correct, right?
That is correct.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So yeah, let's talk about SpaceX. And the other thing I should say, you and I are really deeply into this. Actually, I think my listeners don't know, but that's almost the way which I got into the space industry. I started modeling and doing valuations about SpaceX now almost 8 years ago. And I found it very exciting then. I find it more exciting now. So Aaron, you and I, we could probably completely nerd out about this for many hours, and then we would lose our listeners along the way. So we'll try to keep it high level. So in this vein, I'm not going to assume that everyone here who's listening actually knows the SpaceX business in detail. Can you give us like a snapshot? What actually is SpaceX? What are its main business lines right now, and how important are they relative to each other?
So everyone knows SpaceX for rockets, and some of them exploding, a lot of them landing, and generally speaking, transporting satellites from the ground into space. And so that's obviously a significant part of their business, especially today, more significant. But over the last, let's call it, it's been, I think, about 10 full years since it was originally conceived. But over the last 5 years, what's happened is SpaceX has taken a majority of their launches, and they've been shooting up their own satellites to basically deliver broadband internet, which I'm actually using today. I use Starlink at home. And so hopefully it doesn't, have an error or something, because that would be bad press, I guess. But so a lot of their business today has been Starlink, and has been a substantially and quickly growing part of their business. And in fact, part of our modeling indicates that could be as much as 95%, maybe even a little bit more of their business from a revenue perspective by 2030, just because of the application of billions of people needing internet and access to internet, and being global in nature. They can pretty much sell to anyone that has the capability of buying an internet access kind of point anywhere around the globe. So there's 8 billion customers or thereabouts. So primarily today, those are kind of the two general categories that we look at. You can then take within those categories different things like, launching for government, for defense related customers as well. Inside of the Starlink, let's call it kind of the network connectivity or internet business, you have the ability to do Star Shield, which would be basically providing connectivity for defense specifically. And that got a lot of press during kind of the original build out of Ukraine war and things like that. So those are kind of the broad brushstrokes, the main drivers of the business today, and probably still the vast majority of the business in 2030, maybe a little bit different in the future.
Okay, so launch satellite communications via Starlink. You mentioned Starshield. I think Starshield, if I remember correctly, includes some unspecified remote sensing component as well. And then I guess
that's the conjecture, yes.
There obviously might be very probably is classified stuff there in the middle as well that we just don't know and are not supposed to know. And I guess there's some other things like rounding it out, which sometimes the rounding, if it was an average business, would be very significant, like the lunar stuff, like the HLS, the Human Landing System contract, which is worth billions of dollars. And then you mentioned Starlink. I think you said 2030. You think it could be about 95% of revenue. So again, I want to repeat that just to make sure listeners hear how dominant that is versus the launch business, which is, rockets, like you said, the flashy, visible business. I think it's clearly already the dominant business in 2025, right?
Yeah, okay. Substantial. I think as much as 60. I have to double check my numbers, but yeah, it could be already that high. Just given how quickly it's grown, and really started taking off in 2024, I think, is when we started to see the numbers pick up quite a bit more. But really started taking off from a customer number, early in the 23s and then 24 timeframe. Okay,
cool. So let's dive slightly deeper on these business lines. Like, I guess let's stick to launch and Starlink for now, and leave these other things to the side. So launch, again, I'm not going to assume like the majority of our listeners have done financial modeling before. Sort of like, where do you see the key drivers now? Like when you model this? when you get to like let's start with revenues.
Yeah, when you get to like on the launch side, the key drivers are going to be some of your more of your government contracting and things like that. If we're just focusing in on the launch side of things, and really where what we look at primarily is going to be the cost actually, so the cost per kilogram, because that can kind of create some opportunities for things. And in effect, like it's really the Starship moment, right? So Starship coming in, taking over from Falcon 9. We take SpaceX, Elon, and the public kind of statements. Many of the engineers have made at their word that they will be, decommissioning effectively Falcon 9 over time. Some of the public statements have been made as like 2030, is maybe 2032. I think that's realistic time frame before Falcon 9 starts to stop being the workhorse and starts to tailor down, and then Starship really starts to take a bulk of that load. So when Starship comes in, basically right off the bat, it becomes almost an immediate cost per kilogram drop, maybe even half, even if it was fully expendable. This is one of the reasons we got our conviction up as soon as we started seeing them deploying dummy payloads, because it's a big thing. You don't want to throw even the entire rocket away, but even if you had to, you would already see a substantial drop in cost to SpaceX. Maybe that doesn't mean the cost to the customer, but
Translates
to SpaceX,
to price.
you would see that.
Yes.
Yes. So with that in mind, that's been kind of what we've really been primarily focused a lot on, because it has so many impacts around other parts of the business. So launch itself, like from a revenues perspective, stays pretty small. Then as we move that into 2030, I think it's even as small as 5% or something like that, maybe 7%, depending on how things bake out. But that's really the big one. Starship changes many things. This has been the narrative. This isn't a trodden, and tried and true narrative, I guess. It sticks in the model. It's very obvious in the model when you go look at it.
Okay, so just to recap and rephrase it a little bit. So obviously you have sort of like the number of launches, the type of vehicle you're using, right? Like Starship is a very different vehicle from the current Falcon 9, which is a maximum, which is never fully used, 23.6 ton capacity to LEO. Starship is, somewhere between 100 and 200 tons, depending exactly what configuration you're talking about here. So you have this sort of like number of launches, average capacity of vehicles, gives you like a annual, let's call it up mass, right? And then you're going to assume some sort of, I guess, capacity utilization and then some sort of price. Now, it's interesting. One question here is that you made a very interesting and important point that many people actually in the broader space industry still don't get, which is cost to the launch operator is a very different thing from price to the customer, especially in the case of SpaceX, right? Where there's arguably, well, you can agree or disagree, but arguably no competition, right? We have to see what happens, Blue Origin, New Glenn, and things like that. So is there any sort of assumptions you guys are making around this? Or I guess you must make some assumptions. Are you just kind of assuming pricing is sort of based off today with some inflation? Or are you kind of sometimes think, oh, maybe we should play around with demand elasticity? Like what if they actually drop the price to this level?
Yeah, we didn't in the launch side, we don't play too much around with the price elasticity, mainly because of the trend around the satellite communications being so dominant. So the launch, we didn't play much around with that because
you're saying it's not even worth it. It doesn't move.
Yeah, even if we perfected that curve and predicted it to the T, it almost has no impact. What the price elasticity is built into the SATCOM part like really well, and that really drives the demand. We base it off of like a demand per bandwidth per kilogram kind of number, which is really helpful to scope like how much it will cost per person, or not per person, but per unit of bandwidth, and how that drives down over time. But we're a little bit different, but yes, it's more more flat in the launch one.
On the launch side. Okay, cool. Yeah, we'll definitely get into that aspect of Starlink in a few minutes. So just finish up on launch. So that kind of, we've talked about how we get to revenue, and I think it's very simple arithmetic, and that should make sense to everyone. On a sort of margin side of the launch, I guess a lot is obviously, like you said, driven by the reusability.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It's there's basically, there's the step function change between Falcon 9 and Starship. Like I think that's one of the most underappreciated things. Literally just tonnage to orbit going up that big. even if it's complete, you could throw it away completely. And we use some estimates on what we think the cost of Starship is based on pretty like generally agreed upon numbers. Um, and even just by increasing just the size of the vehicle being bigger and more mass to orbit, it itself makes a big jump down in cost. So like that's the big one, right? Like that's a big step function, completely expendable. And then as it gets reusable, there's another order of magnitude increase of cost reduction too, as it gets fully reusable. So our model, interestingly enough, initially when we started it assumed kind of full expendability for a while. And then what we found was basically way ahead of our schedule. They were catching the booster already. um, so they kind of proved that they can make the booster reusable, I think, faster. And so what that effectively did was increase the reusability factor quicker, even if they never figure out, let's just assume that they never figure out how to do the second stage, they would be driving that cost per kilogram dramatically lower. And you're pushing like the $100 per kilogram type of number. We estimate somewhere between 500 and 700 fully expendable. And then you can bring it an order of magnitude down by being fully reusable. So call it $50 to $70 a kilogram. And somewhere between that 50 and maybe like 100, 200 price is what it would be if they never even got the second stage reusable. This will happen. It's just a matter of time. And so when you take those numbers, it really starts to help with, mass to orbit. But again, like the difference between let's call it 700, 100, and then $70 per kilogram, actually, the math works out quite well. It's almost a rounding error without reusability entirely, how much money they will make. Like it sounds nutty, but based on our models, they could never solve reusability on Starship, and they would basically be making the valuation would be little to no impact in 2030. That's how important the Starship vehicle itself is.
Yeah, I mean, and those are, I mean, just to put some numbers in context, you mentioned that the cost again to SpaceX, I mean, with and without reusability, right? And then I remember, like you mentioned 700, but also like maybe as low as 70, right? At the moment, I think on sort of publicly available numbers, they charge. I mean, it's obviously more complex than this, but I think they're charging around $6,500 per kilogram on a so-called rideshare mission. So again, unless something happens on the revenue side, either through SpaceX's own choice or competition, I mean, that sounds like margins can go very, very healthy there, just on the launch side. Okay, but we said several times now already, like this all pales in comparison to Starlink. So let's run through the same things here, sort of like high level, how to think about Starlink revenue now, and then where it can be, and how the cost structure works on that business.
Yeah. So what we're looking at is, I forget the exact, I think it's like 60, 70 today that we've estimated. And in fact, weirdly enough, the way our model works, our today numbers are actually lower than what Elon has stated. Not because we don't believe it, but it's just the way our model is with Monte Carlos, we don't really pick a hard point in time. We kind of set the variables and they create some range, which is really nice for the probability distribution curve. And so, I don't know, for those out there, if you're using Monte Carlos, you basically pick a set of variables, you pick the wide ranges with which they can be on the worst case and the best case, and then you do Monte Carlo simulations, which is basically a random number. I'm going to oversimplify there, but a random number between those 2 points. And so we did that 17 times, variety of very important variables. And then that's how you come up with these numbers. And then you figure out where the most likely valuation is at the end of all those. It creates a probability curve. And that's where we came up with around a $2.5 trillion valuation, right in the most likely scenarios. So basically the trick is picking those variables, right? So all that to say, sorry, back to the question. Thought process is, it's around 15 billion or so now. I think the estimates that are kind of publicly accepted are in the mid 20 range next year.
Revenue, just to be clear.
Revenue, yes,
yep.
Billions. Sorry, 15 billion roughly today, 24-ish billion in 26 is kind of the estimates. Where we see that really picking up is a little bit of going to feel kind of exponential, is when you start to see the capacity 50x in the Starlink constellation from V3 satellites. That's the estimate, is that just with the upgrades to V3 Starlink, which is basically a lot more power, more massive, so you can get a lot more bandwidth through each satellite, and then therefore to each customer, something like 50x the capacity, and then that's when you really start to see the increase of customers kind of feel more exponential. It already feels quite really fast, but we're expecting somewhere in the range of 150 billion in revenue pushing 2030. That was kind of our rough ranges. Obviously, I'm going to, again, these Monte Carlo simulations create distributions. And so that's why I said like 100 to 150 billion in revenue, because that's a wide range, obviously, but it could actually be more. I didn't even include the bull case numbers. And so that's what we're expecting. We expect to see that based on those. If the Monte Carlos are even close to reality, we would expect to see those really start to kick in 27, 28, because that's when the V3 constellation satellite mix starts to fill out.
So that's like a 10x on revenue over the basically next 4 or 5 years or so, which is obviously even on a sort of annual growth rate, very significant. And then I assume
Yeah.
in 2030, you don't assume it goes into some sort of like low single-digit percentage steady state either. I assume it kind of keeps growing
Yeah,
a little bit.
this is heavily driven by the TAM that we did for that price elasticity curve that we had. And really it's okay, what is the cost per unit of bandwidth? I forget if it was per gigabyte, if we used gigabyte or 100 megabyte, I forget which one that was, but it doesn't really matter. It's per unit of bandwidth. What's the cost of that? And then what's that market look like kind of globally? And then how can you, and as the cost comes down, how much can you capture? So it's a traditional price elasticity curve. Ark did a really good job actually putting it into a chart, because we worked with Ark Invest on this model. They put it into a cool chart, and basically it shows the cost breaking, like basically the cost of them to put it up. It costs them more to put it up than than the amount they can get from customers, right? And I think that broke the plane maybe in 2035-ish, that based on our modeling. Effectively what it means is we'll be bathed in bandwidth. It's something I'm trying to get people to say. I don't know why, but there's a lot of bandwidth we're going to have. It's going to reduce prices ultimately, because you're just going to you're going to have a lot of capacity and supply, which makes it more accessible to billions of people. So we didn't do like hey, it's going to be this many customers by this point. We based it off of what's that unit economic on a per bandwidth basis. What does that total market look like? Which I think was in the 300 billion range is what the rough estimate was. I don't quote me on that one. It's in the charts online. They're all public. So it's like a 300 billion range of things what we thought that the global market opportunity was. And so basically what you're just forecasting is what's SpaceX's share of that as the kind of the demand leader.
Gotcha. Because I guess correct me if I'm wrong, what's going on there is because of this continuous scaling up and then let's call it technological jumps, like going from basically introducing new satellite generations. And you mentioned the Starlink V3 satellite, which is like a significantly bigger, more capable satellite. That I guess at the end of the day, what that must mean is that the marginal cost per whatever you look at, gigabits or something, keeps decreasing. So whereas at the beginning, at some point in time, that marginal cost, it made sense to serve customers like you, Aaron, or people on yachts or something. At some point in time, you can serve customers, I don't know, in rural India, actually, and still make a positive gross margin.
Well, it'll be a bit more than that, but the principle is sound. The details are, and I can use myself as an example. It might make it real. So we have to pay. I'm in a region where probably because I'm on the Space Coast in Florida, and there are a lot of Starlink employees, or well, SpaceX employees, so they are familiar with Starlink and buy it. Like I am not in an area where I ever get any discounts. We're always on the edge of like capacity demands, right? You're right at the edge. So we pay the full price for Starlink. Having said that, I'm on the islands in Florida. There's basically one provider for cable. Fiber optic doesn't exist here. There's the traditional kind of cable spectrum provider. So I only have the one. My price has already increased to the same rate as a Starlink monthly. So I can just swap out to Spectrum today, from Spectrum to Starlink today, and I don't pay any more. But that's just the nature of having only one supplier. And after, you get the discount initially, you can't switch to someone else. So with that being said, like what'll happen over time is that, yes, let's say it's $100 per gigabit, of speed, gigabit, the thing you pay for when you go buy Spectrum, is a gigabit per second. Then that'll come down over time because supply is going up. It's just a supply demand kind of calculation. And so what we've estimated is basically this V3 satellites are 50 times more, let's call it gigabit per second per satellite than the old ones. So as like 50%, maybe 25, 50% of the constellation are V3 satellites, you have a lot more bandwidth. As that becomes 100%, you now have 50 times the bandwidth you did from the current constellation. And so what'll happen is you're bathed in bandwidth, the cost will drop. It's not a linear, one-to-one relationship, 50x less or anything, but there is a demand. Now, the nuance that I wanted to bring up is this is a satellite that is think of it as a global, it's like it's the cell tower that moves around the person versus people moving around cell towers. And so that cell tower or that, broadband delivery mechanism is going to be the same cost if you give me satellite internet as if you give someone something really cheap in India today. So there already are price discrepancies based on the local markets. So that I'm using the same, satellite for a few seconds that someone in India is going to use later in the day or what have you. They're all over the world. I think one of the bigger users is, I want to say Nigeria. There's a couple of cities in Africa that love this because they have the capability to, get internet relatively cheaply, and they aren't paying the same price I'm paying today. So it gives the SpaceX the ability to meet or match markets, regional markets, and then they'll be, because the capacity is going up, they'll be able to drop costs to be even more competitive. And then that's when we'll start to see kind of the bandwidth wars or something like that, where it'll be better for customers long term, but they will probably meet supply and demand. They're very market driven companies. Elon companies are very market driven. They're not going to cut costs just because they can to the consumer, but at the same time, they will be able to make some, great opportunities. I think consumers are going to have a ton of bandwidth, and then the direct sell thing plays into this as well.
Okay, cool. And so as a side effect, that by the way also means some of us who have homes in various places in the world, like if for some reason you're between India and US, you should probably get your Starlink subscription in India from the sense of it. But I want to, jokes aside, I want to pick up on one thing you said in there, which is, I didn't realize just the orders of magnitudes here, that the bandwidth capability, I guess it is, of the Starlink next generation, the V3, is 50x the current one. Because I guess the important, or one other important aspect here is that well, again, none of us has the inside numbers, but we're assuming that the cost of that satellite, the investment, even on a sort of annual or depreciation per gigabits, is not 50x, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No,
Okay.
the metric we track, and I think we invented it. I mean, it's just a derivative of metrics that exist, but what we track is called bandwidth per kilobit, or sorry, bandwidth per kilogram. And basically the idea is like, for a given kilogram of mass that you're putting up, how much bandwidth are you pulling out of that? Right. And that's an important metric for us, because basically as you hit V3s, it already improved over time. By the way, these are all on the website. All of this stuff most of this is publicly available in charts and graphs that we put together. But that bandwidth per bandwidth mass, and there's a better name for it, but I'm blanking on it right now. But it's how much bandwidth can you get out of a kilogram? It goes up as every iteration that they make. So it went actually up substantially when they went from V2 to the V2 minis, which were like a miniature version of Starlink. It went up substantially from the iteration before. They even made something that people weren't paying attention to. We were, because we geek out on this stuff, but they made an optimization where they improved mass efficiency. I think it was about 20% on the V2 mini. So it's actually like a V2 mini V2, so to speak. We called it V2 mini optimized. And when they were able to get 2 more satellites in 2 to 3 more satellites per launch of the same V2 kind of structure. And so what that meant was the kilogram cost went down. And so their bandwidth went up a little bit. And you can actually see these in the numbers with bandwidth as well. So fundamentally, as you're tracking that, what happens is if you take the V3 satellite numbers that they've released publicly, these are Starlink puts this out, SpaceX puts this out on their website, and you look at what Elon and other engineers are saying on X, then what you will see is those claims, assuming that they're true, which they almost always are, and maybe they aren't from day one, but they eventually get there, then effectively that's where you see that big jump that can be anywhere between 20 and 50x. I use 50x because it just the assumption is there'll be some optimizations over time. And I think that's the Constellation total increase that Morgan Stanley used as well. So it's easier to kind of use something that someone else is saying as well. So those are kind of the numbers that we look at. And yes, that's going to be it. And really it's driven by how much more efficiency can they drive out of the same kilogram. Obviously, the whole system will be bigger, but when the system gets bigger in orbit, you can put more power through it. And it's generally cheaper per kilogram as well. So bandwidth per kilogram is an important thing to track. You get a sense of the performance and then the bandwidth that comes out as they keep launching. And then obviously, if you're launching and your cost is per kilogram effectively, you care about the kilogram mass in that scenario.
Yeah, which, so again, as to trying to recap, so that makes a lot of sense. So bandwidth per kilogram as sort of a, I guess, revenue driver in a way. But then, like you kind of alluded to a few times now, the other important aspect is that the cost per kilogram, like both of the satellite and the launch, due to some of these things we mentioned, like Starship becoming increasingly online and new generations of satellites, those are also materially decreasing. So again, this combination bodes very well for the Starlink margin at the end of the day.
Yeah, we call that. I just remembered the name, by the way. It's called bandwidth density. That's what we call it. How much bandwidth can you pack into a dense area, one area of kilogram, and so that's really what that's the technical driver, and you buy by the bandwidth, right? You buy by the gigabit per second or what have you. So it allows you to kind of connect the economic side and the revenue side to the technology advancements. And so that's where you see the V3 is huge. What you see this massive jump in bandwidth density because of V3. And there probably will be a V4 or some optimized version of V3 as well. But like that's kind of the nature of the SpaceX satellite constellation. Bandwidth density drives these massive improvements in capacity, which impact the supply demand market, everything.
And so in order to make this happen, I guess, like we started talking about, they're really putting everything in place. One really important aspect is Starship. Another really important aspect is those satellites and being able to, well, let's say volume manufacturing, but they are doing that, right? They've proven they can manufacture more satellites. I think Elon tweets about this sometimes. I think today there was an X post again where he said they're operating more than twice all of the other satellites combined. So it's really quite quite impressive.
That post was in response to my analysts, by the way. We were covering
on orbital data centers. We'll get to that. Yes.
Yeah. Well, it's because there's so much debate on all this stuff, and we were just doing the math. And he's like, "Yeah, we kind of know what we're talking about." I think it's important for people to understand that you're looking at the company that has made more satellites than anyone in human history, as far as I can tell. Right? Like, this is absolutely historic. So they can pump this out. I have no doubt. Like when you compare it to other people making other claims, maybe there's public companies like AST, Space Mobile, or things like that. They're talking about doing these manufacturing lines of satellites. And it's like, okay, I love the aspiration. We know SpaceX has been able to do it, but it's a different execution risk when you talk about the company that's made the most satellites in human history and proven it versus, an aspiration to build, either big or small or large constellations, whatever. It's just like, it's important. I think underwriting that's a very different risk set. And then you can a lot of people like to, pros and con, on the pro and con side, they like to take what Elon says and either just believe it wholeheartedly or completely, hand wave it away. The reality is it should be more towards the believe. It's maybe the timeline you can't believe necessarily or know exactly when, and it's important investment, and I get that. But at the same time, like, these guys have done it. They've put a ton out. They've put a ton of satellites. They've launched, the most, I think, launch vehicles in US history, something like that, or very close to it, are on their way. And so they know how to make this stuff. They know how to make it at scale.
Yeah, no, for sure. And we'll talk about this in a few minutes. It's what I would call like the franchise value of SpaceX beyond just the operating revenue cash flow generating businesses. Just to finish up on Starlink, because yeah, so they'll have the launch vehicles, they have the satellites, and then some people may have recently seen and wondering, oh my God, they paid whatever 17, 18 billion dollars for wireless spectrum from EchoStar, and then I think there was even a second deal shortly after that. That also is to basically make this happen, this very, very um, significant opportunity. Now, I want to kind of so we talked a little bit about revenue. At some point in time, companies should have operating profits. Well, they have cash flows, obviously. Actually, I think Elon, in another recent ex post, when they were talking about doing, as they regularly do, a tender offer for employee shares, Elon made it very clear that they're not raising money because um, they're financed out of current cash flows. And he says, I think he said, and we have been for a while. But anyway, I kind of want to get sort of on a very high level to this, like, margin question, how you guys are thinking about what is I mean, at what level are you even
Yeah.
looking at margins? Because
Yeah.
frankly, well, I don't know if you agree or not. Like, I'm looking at SpaceX and I actually hope they're not making any operating margin because frankly, I would like them to reinvest absolutely every dollar into R&D and
Yeah.
marketing for things like Starlink. But how are you guys looking at it?
Yeah. We think about like the gross margins as you start doing the numbers over time because you put all the money in up front effectively. You have to build the satellite, you have to launch it, and there's a lot of those costs that are, I don't know if it's 90%, but the vast majority are sitting up front in CapEx, and then the operating expenditure per satellite is relatively minimal. And so what we've kind of forecasted is that over time, once you factor in, the cost was up front, and then you can basically sell the bandwidth that you're producing from that satellite for 5 years. And then also the idea that because of the way that connection and internet connection works, there's a standard oversubscription ratio built in, right? Not everyone is pulling every maximum bandwidth they need at the same exact time. This is how, like, this sounds a little bad that people are selling more than they actually have the capacity to produce, but this is how telcos work. Some estimates like 100x oversubscription. That's one of the reasons why if you're in like a really packed area or there's like a natural disaster, some of the cell phones don't work because now everyone's trying to use it at the exact same time. And historically, that just doesn't happen in everyday use. And so that once you factor those two things in, you have this really high opportunity for high gross margins, which we estimate can approach like 85%, which is kind of nuts when you think about like a really heavy hardware business. But that's really the business of telco in general, like telecommunications. It's like invest up front and then harvest cash over time. And you really want a higher margin.
And
But
and
because of
frankly,
what they do,
even legacy satellite operators have achieved, very,
yeah,
very. I mean, it's not completely apples to apples,
yeah.
but these margins are not unheard of.
And I will say when we try and get a valuation back into it. So when we forecast like a valuation 2030, it's just kind of like we'll use some kind of general multiples. Either we can anchor it on revenue or we can anchor it on what we believe to be kind of the free cash flows and kind of an earnings multiple. When we try and get an estimate of what that is today, we actually take the free cash flows and kind of pull that back in, and we use like very conservative multiples, like they're approaching like Lockheed Martin levels, which I don't think that's one way we can kind of bake in conservatism into it just by using like a Lockheed Martin level of a multiple to get the value. But it's been pretty good so far when we do those numbers because both in October of 2024 and October of 2025, we released numbers that were within 5% of the big surprise markups that happened in those December tenders. And so we weren't necessarily planning on hitting and we were hoping, there'd be opportunities to buy and kind of capture the alpha. But the reality was that, it does work and it can kind of forecast pretty well when you look at it that way.
So where does that get you? I mean, that methodology for evaluation, or I guess evaluation range, since you guys are doing Monte Carlo simulations and have
Yeah.
various cases. So obviously a number has been thrown around in various sources. I don't think it was officially confirmed by anyone, unless I missed something, of 1.5 trillion market value at a potential IPO next year. What do you guys think, if you want to talk about it?
We haven't like tried to forecast. One of the reasons we haven't tried to forecast like what the exact IPO should be valued at is mainly because there's several impacting factors, like the timing of the actual IPO, which is kind of unknown. Like there's been rumors and reports that there's been tacitly, confirmed, but the reality is that the IPO is basically they're going to go through a kind of a bake-off process, and they will, you know, the number will be decided in that bake-off process. So that might be the target. It could be higher, it could be lower. I think that's reasonable. We'll have to see where it lands. Now, as far as like trying to forecast what the actual value of the company is in a given moment, that's difficult. But what we do is we have been good at, I think we've been lucky a couple times, but the reality is what we need to do is get a sense of how much money they're actually bringing in, because we've done some rough analysis. And basically, what we believe the vast majority of that cash flow is going to be used for is accelerating Starship, accelerating V3 satellites, which then also accelerate the whole in-space compute capability. They're all very tied closely together. The infrastructure is still Starship. The infrastructure is still the V3 satellite Starlink platform, even if there's computers in there instead of communications equipment. And so accelerating that, what that really does is pulls forward some of the revenue projections that we had, because now our model was basically leveraging how much free cash flow they do, take X dollars, percentage of those dollars, the vast majority of those dollars, bake it back into Starships and V3 satellites and do more, right? That's how the model works. And so when you have 30 billion additional dollars or whatever they end up doing, it actually brings forward a lot of the Starship development, brings forward a lot of the V3 development, all those things. So we've forecasted that as much as 50 billion additional dollars have been pulled forward from in 2030. So that 150 billion kind of number that we had roughly estimated, it could be 200 billion in revenue that they're able to pull forward. So that changes valuation. So if you're able to pull things for 50 billion additional dollars, potentially, 25% more revenue faster, then that can be impactful. Not to say that it's guaranteed by any means, but this is more capacity strained than it is demand strained. It's like everyone wants internet. So that's part of the question on the valuation. The 1.5 could be easily more like 2 trillion if that's the case. But we're going to have to kind of, sharpen the pencils a little bit and really get down to the details, because an impending SpaceX IPO middle of next year or whatever is definitely going to be a lot more people caring about the timing and the price at the time that they're investing or the time frame they're thinking about investing.
Yeah, 100% agree. And it's interesting to sort of like how you phrase it, the pulling forward and like, having suddenly enormous amounts, well, by anyone's standard, enormous amounts of additional capital to work with, right? Because I mean, phrasing it another way, what's going on here, Elon has a legitimate track record of taking a dollar and just delivering a extremely good return on capital on that, right? So if he takes in whatever he's going to take in 30 billion in IPO, like rightly or wrongly, but history would say rightly, people are going to not put that in at 30 billion book value, but say like, well, 30 billion historically, if you give him $1 for PayPal, if you give him $1 for Tesla, if you gave him $1 for, SpaceX, if you gave it to him 10 years ago, the return on this capital has been very, very high. So this is like this whole future value creation potential, which actually brings me to another sort of a set of questions I want to talk about. So I mentioned before that I also want to talk a little about what I call like franchise value of SpaceX, right? Because we talked about the existing current businesses that are producing revenues and cash flows right now, large and substantially, Starlink, right? But I mean, SpaceX is an incredible thing right now. If you think about just the strengths, I mean, just off the top of my head, and then I'm probably forgetting some stuff and you can add. I mean, it's the most experienced launch provider, most proven launch provider in the world, right? It's the most, you mentioned this, the most experienced satellite integrator and operator in the world. God knows how much intellectual property they have. I have no idea, but it must be immense. I'm imagining they must have one of the largest, but probably most motivated space workforce that anyone has in the world, right? They have credibility with investors, as we just basically discussed. They have credibility with governments. So the question almost becomes, or what I'm going to get is like, what can you do with that? It's almost like you can, whatever comes up, at least in space, and we'll talk about the AI computer in a second. Like for me, and of course I'm talking my book here, is like it's hard for me to think of anyone else who's better placed to expand sorry, to exploit whatever additional opportunities for new business lines may come up that SpaceX may judge worthy of pursuing, right? That's another aspect because they're so big that they won't pursue everything because it doesn't move the needle anymore, right? Just as in the past, they didn't pursue Earth observation because they judged it just doesn't move the needle compared to satellite communications. But yeah, I mean, first point, so would you agree to my assessment that like they're basically better placed than anyone else in the world to exploit future space opportunities? And then what do you think some of these future business line opportunities may be that are not in the model yet?
Yeah, when you're talking about, I'm going to make a comment about Elon. I mean, I think historically there's a really strong argument to be made that he's the greatest resource allocator in the world, right? Like he could take something that most people think are insane and he could turn it into a lot of tremendous value. I think maybe that's part of the way he thinks about things. He just doesn't, he's not trying, I don't think he's sitting there trying to say, I'm going to take this dollar and turn it into this dollar. When you optimize for that, you end up buying like, I don't know, things that are very quick, short-term thinking. It tends to be the way that institutional Wall Street, because of the way the math works, is optimized for because it's incentivized that way. He thinks about building deep, long-term value for humanity. And by nature of humanity getting value, we end up creating growth and do more
As
things with
a
it. I think that's
side
just the
effect,
one.
financial value. Yeah,
It's a
thank
side
you.
effect.
You're absolutely
And
right. I'm betraying
yeah,
my hedge fund background, but you're absolutely right.
but like, as an investor, you can look at that as long as you have the right patience and the right risk tolerance, then that's the right move to make, right? So anyway, maybe the greatest resource allocator in the world. He basically, it's like he's playing a video game. Um, he uses his resources and just turns it into this amazing thing. So I think that's like kind of the baseline here. You're talking about the infrastructure. This is part of the reason why like space infrastructure, it's all hardware. Like it's a very hard thing to do and you have to build it at a scale that's incredible to achieve what they need to do. So yes, if you aren't taking SpaceX into account, if you're investing in space or thinking about opportunities, then you're betraying your own biases or clearly a big blind spot. I think your biggest opportunity is where is SpaceX if you're investing in new companies or what have you. It's like where is SpaceX not want to participate? It makes sense that they want to go after AI compute. These are multi-trillion-dollar industries. They went after the connectivity because it's a multi-trillion-dollar opportunity, right? They're not necessarily going after some of these other things, like maybe the movement in orbit, because these are big markets, but they're not trillion-dollar markets, at least in their, where they think they should be spending their time. So that's the way I think about this. This basically sets yourself up very well for you need someone to start another planet of humans. I think you need a SpaceX. It needs to exist, right? It sets yourself like, what would someone like that do? You probably want that person being the one that tells you how to, or at least starts the movement of starting another planet, right? And putting human civilization there. It's going to be the nature of it. There's just so many opportunities out there, and you probably need to think about, yes, if there's $1 trillion asteroid or whatever, I would expect that SpaceX starts to play into that market. Ultimately, it's not the current goal, but those kind of things are
But
where they would play.
that's exactly my point. Like, if something comes up that seems a big enough opportunity and it's sort of space related, I just don't see how anyone else from today's point of view is going to be better placed if there is this $1 trillion asteroid, or it's just generally space mining becomes a thing. If, I don't know, in space manufacturing becomes a giant thing. If actually, it's funny. One thing I keep remembering is I think it's back in 2019. Quinn Shotwell, like in an interview, teased this whole thing about Starship terrestrial point-to-point flights, right? I mean, the airline industry is also I think it's a multi-trillion-dollar industry, right? I mean, it just seems like there's so many
Yeah.
potential things. It's kind of like a richness of choices, and again, it's sort of like, what do they even think is worth spending their
Yeah.
time on?
Well, it's like an analogy I think that helps potentially investors and things like that. Just to keep this in mind, is like um, think of this as Rockefeller's oil and Vanderbilt's railroads, combined into one person doing that, right? Like they built the railroads to transport the oil. In this case, maybe the oil is connection and data. That's what we originally were thinking, but now it looks like maybe it's intelligence, AI, right? Like the oil is intelligence, but if Rockefeller had his own railroads and his own pipelines, which is Starlink, he just maybe had connected the whole thing. And so, yes, like it's hard to view where you're not playing, if you're playing against Rockefeller and Vanderbilt from the industrial era, you're not playing a fair game.
Yeah,
The odds are stacked against you.
I'm fully with you though. I made this comparison to like the railroad barons in the first chapter of my space economy book, and I think a lot about the railroads. I think a lot U.S. Steel, Standard
Yep.
Oil. I'm even thinking about things like well, this is a different podcast episode, but the historical exploration companies, like like
Yep.
the British and Dutch exploration companies. But anyway, okay, you guys just quickly finishing up on future businesses. So AI compute not in your current model. Do you think it has to be in a model? Will it be in a model from today's perspective?
We'll be updating it. When Kathy Wood was sharing the model that we worked on together, Elon said you have to add that. So we're going to go look at it and try and figure out. Like I think the hardest part right now is really conceptualizing the concept of an
Mm,
AI bit stream as a unit economic. Like it's something that there are tokens and things like that. There are correlations, but like thinking about this over time, it's going to be hard to think about that in like a 5-10 year window. Longer term, it may be not as relevant from a modeling perspective, but it is something that we're actively working on. And we've been doing a lot of research recently on kind of the underlying engineering challenges around AI in space and all of that, so that we can kind of have a strong baseline to go into the modeling of what does this mean over 3, 5, 10 years.
Okay, and then speaking, just finishing up on sort of, I guess, the overall modeling. Speaking of things which are hard to conceptualize, you do have a tab in your model that's called Mars. And
Yeah.
I mean, maybe what's the quick summary of that? From what I could tell, it's sort of, I guess, because it is so hard to conceptualize in detail at this point in time, it seems like it's almost like the investment, the cash flow accreting at like book value. It's not a
Yeah.
specific business yet,
It's
right?
really book value because it's the simplest thing, and it's hard to say like is it real estate or is it whatever, are there values to real estate? Like no one really subscribes value to international waters, but like if there was a platform there, there'd be a value, but you had to build an oil platform in international waters to get to that value or something like that, right? So like effectively, it's we take the book value of Mars over time. And part of that is, and one of the easier ways of looking at it is basically by taking Optimus, ascribing it a value of human labor and productivity, and that's that idea I think really came from Brett at Ark, which I liked. It was like it's a good way to kind of like you don't have to defend every little detail of what value is. It's more like, okay, hey, do you believe a humanoid robot can produce a certain percentage of human labor productivity? And as that happens, as they put more robots on the planet, then you can kind of get a sense of what the productivity and the value is over time. And you just the assumption you have to make is that they're not wasting their complete time. So the book value would be something that might be on SpaceX's books for a long time and never realized. It could be on something that is like instantly realized. But that drives this into it's a really long tail distribution because there's so many weird outcomes. Like whereas the Starlink distribution is more traditional, it looks like a
Mm.
probability curve, like high probability in the middle. Whereas the Mars one's like kind of like a little bump and really long tails because it's just so hard to predict. But that's into the 10 trillion plus kind of number. It's 10 years out into the future. It's based on potentially having 1 million robots on Mars, making landing pads, digging trenches, putting up, facilities to make methane and fuel and all this stuff. So these are like, it's a bit futuristic, but it was important for me that we made that argument because I wanted it to at least be put on the paper because I think it's important for investors to realize like there will be value. I don't think it's reasonable to suggest that it's going to be normal traditional timelines of return, but to suggest that it's a complete waste of time and zero value creation is also not true. And it's, humanity being planetary is valuable. It's one of those binary flip switches in my mind. Like all of a sudden it will be worth a lot and it will be obvious, but you have to get to that point. And so I
Yeah.
think SpaceX, fairly or unfairly will take most of that value.
And again, it goes back to the same point as before, and the point we just made is sort of like Elon has a track record of taking this excess cash and sort of investing it in a value accreting way. I mean, if you didn't think this was possible, I mean, the standard financial markets alternative would be to just pay dividends or buy back shares. But I hope that's not going to happen. I hope we're going to build out mass, but that's just me, obviously. We're almost
And it's
there.
all very similar architecture too. Like this is not like he's not. It's not like this only thing ever works for Mars, right? Like what making it reusable on Earth, the Starship reusable on Earth makes it landable on Mars. Making it big makes it you can throw up V3 satellites. It makes you ability. It gives you the ability to put a lot of tonnage on Mars. So like they're all very similar. Like I think even as a public company, the R&D written to Mars specifically as a loss is going to be relatively small. I think a lot of space enthusiasts like, oh, it's trillions of dollars to do this. They'll never be able to invest. I'm like, have you ever looked at Google's R&D lines? They blow 5 billion or something every year on other R&D that I'm sure they never have to justify to anyone. No one even asks about it, right? And so I think that'll be like things that are Mars only infrastructure, art research and development is a small business line item. You're going to have maybe Jared Isaacman, incoming NASA administrators, doing things that gives them, contracts that try and develop some of that as well for NASA. These are all things that are the likely future of SpaceX, and I think it's all going to be mainly invested in the shared architecture that allows for all of the great revenue driving things that SpaceX is doing.
Cool. I think like three more questions or so, and then again we could keep going for hours here, and I'd actually like to. One is, so we talked a lot about sort of key drivers like Starship, for example, V3 satellites. I guess the flip side of that is if you think about risks, like obvious risk factors you'd expect to find in the IPO prospectus, which are not kind of boring stuff that lawyers put in, and also I guess let's also leave out the key man risk on Elon because that's kind of so obvious. What else do you think are
Yeah.
the most important ones?
The big risks, I think, if you're looking at, as an investor on the outside looking in, I think there's going to be a kind of a market risk. This may not be something that's in a prospectus. I'm not sure if they would say this, but this is the most like sought after. This will be the most sought after IPO in a decade, probably more. This is a company that's
Maybe
captured
ever. I mean,
maybe
again, I'm
ever.
trying to
Right.
go back to
Yeah.
historical. I mean, maybe like the Dutch East India
Yeah.
Company. I have no idea. Like, yeah.
Yeah, like the companies were new back then. The concept of a company as an abstract
Yes.
entity was new. Like that is like now it's like, okay, this is a mission. This is captured imagination. They're clearly innovating. There are many, many people, including myself, that have wanted access for a very, very long time, right? So um, the demand, I think, will produce probably a short-term irrational exuberance. I think it's that like it probably won't be a price that's not justified long term, but the markets and institutions and I think the majority of money that moves on any given day is actually driven by algorithms, won't care about that. So I think as an investor, understand that there will be volatility in this because the long-term investors are not the majority of people buying these things. Like it's actually short-term momentum that moves this stuff a lot. And so that's more of a product of that. I think there's risk there. I think that's not short term. That's short term risk, not long term risk. I think long term risk, some of the biggest things you have, and I'm going to talk about the real tail events, which are really small chance of happening, but really a big impact. And I think the biggest thing that I'm mostly concerned about because it's a big changer is nationalization talk, which has already been stated. Like this is not, I'm not making this up. I'm not speaking this into existence. Other people have spoken this into existence in the populist socialist movements because they see, hey, there's a big strategic importance to SpaceX. And then they say falsely that we funded the whole thing, like all the money came from the government. He wouldn't exist without us. Like we should just take SpaceX over. That's been stated. And I think populism in the US is kind of on the rise. I think the way to offset that risk is to get more people invested. So I think the IPO is a
Mhm.
way of addressing that risk. I think there's even further ways you can do it. I think it should be in every Invest America fund account.
It should be,
Um,
honestly, it should be in the Trump, those Trump accounts that just got
yeah,
funding
Trump
from Dell
accounts.
and Ray Dalio. I think like
Yeah.
Trump, that should be a part of Trump accounts in my humble opinion.
If I was, in the Elon chair or whatever, like yeah, assuming it's possible and there's not some weird thing about having individual stock in these accounts or something. 1% right across the board, right to 25 million accounts. You have literally two generations, the kids and then the parents of those kids who are immediately invested in your future. And any kind of talk of these political wins, which is just going to happen because Elon is a lightning rod sometimes for these people. Whether and he's going to be a trillionaire. Like I don't think anyone's doubting this at this point. Well, I'm sure some people wish that won't happen, but he'll be a trillionaire. That's going to draw a different type of political ire. And so I think that's another thing. You just want people bought into that future. So I think the IPO addresses some of that risk, but that's I think one of the biggest, craziest risks, and I think it should be acknowledged. I don't think it's American for that talk to be happening. I don't want it to happen. I just know that there are people that I don't agree with that are already making these claims on both sides of the aisle, by the way, which is nuts. Like normally you think that's a one side or the other thing, but no, they're both have been said by different parties, like more populist socialist sort of groups. And so it'll happen. It'll continue to happen. I believe SpaceX, the numbers I'm expecting for SpaceX are so big that like I'm kind of in that optimist route. So I think it's just going to become so important, especially if Mars is a thing. The only way to get there, they're going to basically control access to another planet. Like you
Yeah.
don't think people are going to start, asking for that? So
I
I
mean,
think it's
it's going
important
to
to
be
get many people bought in.
quasi sovereign, if not almost de facto sovereign powers at that point. Again, the only historical parallels I can think about is stuff like the British East India Company, which controlled large parts of India. But I forget the exact history now, but it did end up getting nationalized. So to your point.
Yeah.
Um, okay,
Yeah.
so final question to you, sort of fun question. I know you've thought about it. When when would we sell SpaceX? I have
So,
my answer.
well, it's really hard to, I think the only time you sell it is when there's certain things you have to do, like like a tax event or something like that. There's certain things you have to do sometimes to do it that have nothing to do with the actual value of the company. So as of now, that's the way I look at it. I think there may be an argument to be said if Elon is no longer with us for a variety of reasons at the helm. Maybe that makes sense. Having said that, one of my most famously personal wrong calls was when Steve Jobs passed. I was like,
Mm,
"Oh, Apple will never innovate again." I was
I'm
absolutely
with you
right.
there.
I just did not. I just did not guess that their stock would appreciate quite dramatically. So I think there's like a scenario there into the future, long-term future, hopefully very long-term future, where maybe there's those questions start to come up. But for me, it's like there's so with the innovation at the helm, investing. I think the space compute thing is a very intelligent move. I don't think it's I'm just chasing hype or creating more hype bubble. I think it's a very intelligent move to say, listen, I have the infrastructure in place and there's physics-based reasons why at a demand scale that most people can't really underwrite in their own heads. They can't understand how much in demand for intelligence there will be. At that demand scale, I'm like the best person to do that in Elon's head, SpaceX, to be able to provide these data centers. Like that's a great move. And if you have that person or that kind of mindset leading the company, even if it's a $1 trillion company, even if it's a $2 trillion, a $5 trillion company, then there's nothing saying it won't be the $50 trillion company because it's just going to have so much advantage. Anything
Mm.
that's expansion oriented, it's going to have so much advantage. So that's the short answer is never, except for, personal reasons, because you need to like pay taxes or buy a house or, pay for a family member for something, something like that.
Yeah, 100%. So I actually got asked that question by a banker, I think in 2018, when it was like a 20 billion valuation. And my answer was actually your answer, sort of like never. And then I added half jokingly, like, oh, maybe when it's traded on the Mars stock exchange. And the thinking
Yeah.
there was like, well, if that happens, then things worked out. Um,
Yeah.
but really, I'm actually with you, sort of like never. And actually, I don't even remember that actually Elon is with you as well. There was a sort of
Yeah.
all hands email to all staff from Elon, I think 2013-ish or so, where he said exactly that. Like, well, actually, you shouldn't sell unless you kind of need it to maintain your lifestyle.
Yeah.
So
I mean, and there's mechanisms. Like you could be sitting on $1 billion worth of stock. You don't even need the money. Like in today's day and age, do you actually need $1 billion to live? I mean, realistically, no. So like there's going to be situations where maybe there's another company doing something else that you're interested in that has nothing to do with what SpaceX does or, health or something, right? Sure. There's going to be growth. But if you're strictly looking at it from a growth opportunity and like low risk growth opportunity, it's going to be hard to beat, and it should be thought from that lens. Anything beyond that is going to be higher risk, and there's going to be appetites for high risk in investments. But yeah, that's the way I think about it. It's kind of a no-brainer. There are obviously going to be risks. I think those risks are fairly long tail edge risks. So we'll see.
100%. And so maybe we'll talk again after the IPO and we see how wrong we all were. All right. Well,
Yeah.
it'll be a fun year if it happens this way. Aaron, thank you so much.
Yeah.
We could have talked for hours. This is so much fun. In case this wasn't clear, let me state it again. The Ark investment and a Mach33 joint SpaceX model is actually publicly available on GitHub. So we'll post that link, and there's also like an explainer website. We'll post both of those links in the episode notes, and I encourage people who have any sort of interest in the valuation, financial modeling of SpaceX to take a look. It's a great model. Thanks, Aaron.
Yeah, we have. I'll just mention here. We have research.33fg. It's all publicly available. We have our own explainer on that. We update it all the time. So a lot of deep dives on space data centers and all sorts of stuff. So people can go there. You can sign up or not. Most of it's accessible without a blocker. So have at it.
That's great. Thanks for all the work you guys are doing. It's very valuable for the community. Thanks again, Aaron, and we'll speak soon.
Thanks for having me.
And that's it for another nominal episode of the Space Business Podcast. And once more, if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform, such as Apple or Spotify. You can follow us on Twitter at podcast_space. We're also on LinkedIn under the Space Business Podcast. Lastly, if you have any feedback, including ideas for guests, and that may even include yourself if you have an exciting space story to tell, or interested in becoming a sponsor, or really for any other suggestions, you can drop us an email at spacebusinesspodcast@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening, and see you for the next episode.